Good afternoon, viewers. We are now discussing a new series of lectures pertaining to ancient India, and we are picking up the economic dimension of it in terms of the stages of early Indian economy. And in the previous lecture, I just summarized the nomenclatures that are used to categorize or classify early Indian economic history in terms of its prehistoric subsistence-based economy leading to the urban experiment in the form of Harappan civilization, thereafter the pastoral phase represented by the early Vedic or Rigvedic society, and then iron-based production happening around 600 BC, leading to territoriality of states and so forth. In 6th century BC, then state control of economy in the form of the Mauryan Empire, emergence of the Mauryan Empire. The post-Mauryan Empire is again studied with reference to smaller farms and very monetized, intensively monetized economy. So there is prevalence of coins and overseas trade, Roman trade, and so forth. And then that leads to the Gupta period, from where we can also see the beginning of feudal tendencies. So broadly, these are the classificatory categories into which early Indian economy is, or changes in early Indian economy is sought to be studied. Now, having briefly discussed the outline in the previous lecture of mine, let's now set on to discussing each of these categories in little bit of details. For example, the first category that we spoke of is prehistoric subsistence-based economy. So this pertains to the period prior to the beginning of civilizational life, or you can say beginning of the Harappan period. So the entire Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic period can be clubbed into the prehistoric subsistence-based economy. So what unites this huge timeline, prehistoric timeline, is that production that is happening, and that started happening only during the Neolithic period, when man became cultivator of grains, and they started domesticating animals alongside plants, and that could lead to procuring some dairy products or hides and so forth, animal products, which could be stored and even exchanged with other people. Nevertheless, there is no market that had come into being. And so this production, even if it is surplus production happening in the Neolithic period, in contrast to the earlier two prehistoric periods, that is Paleolithic and Mesolithic, the Neolithic surplus production is not happening for the market. It is happening for purposes that largely are cultural in nature, and in order to facilitate some kind of exchange, people are storing some of these items, which now they can store, because there is capacity enhancement in terms of production on account of advent of cultivation, agriculture, and also animal husbandry or pastoralism. Neolithic, if you look at it from the subcontinental dimension context, it's not, or Neolithic phase of economic activity does not begin all at once across the subcontinent. So if we look at the area around what we know as Mehergarh, which is in present day Pakistan, the beginning of Neolithic life can be traced as back as up to say 7,000, 6,000 BC itself. And this becomes important because subsequently it is this area that went on to throw the first civilizational example in the Indian subcontinent in the form of the Indus Valley civilization, or Harappan civilization as we call it. because there is a gradual capacity building, there is a gradual economic and social segregation that is happening ever since surplus production started happening due to beginning of Neolithic life in the northwestern part of India. So, in the northwestern part of India, we have this kind of a beginning happening right around say 7000, 6000 BCE, whereas in other parts of India, largely this Neolithic beginning cannot be traced before 3000 BCE. So, it is largely around 3000 BCE where we find, be it North India, be it the Vindhyan range or Central India or Eastern Neolithic or even Southern Neolithic, largely they emerge, the Neolithic stage is arrived at only around 3000 or little after it, 3000 BCE. So, there is no chronological homogeneity in terms of beginning of Neolithic way of life in early India, in the Indian subcontinent. Also important is the fact that by around this time, for example, I just use these categories: Central Indian Neolithic, North Indian Neolithic, Eastern Indian Neolithic, Southern Neolithic, or Ash Mound sites as they are known as. This is because the earliest traces of regional, you can say, homogeneity can be at least seen. I am not saying that regions emerged during this period, but there is some regional semblance to the food basket that came into being during the Neolithic, or the way they used to live, the houses. For example, in Kashmir area, there is this practice of peat dwellings with thatched houses, and actual living area is beneath the soil. So, it's dug deep inside and then the roof is thatched. So, or for that instance, dog burials and several other cultural practices also, apart from the variety of grains, which also shows a semblance of homogeneity. That could be on account of the ecological conditions, on account of soil conditions and so forth. But for example, if you look at the Eastern Neolithic, you find most of the rice growing sites or several other pottery traditions are also appearing to be similar. Similar kind of design and fabric of the ceramics. South India Neolithic, if you see, has this very peculiar practice where just outside, little bit away from the habitation area, you find the practice of ash mounds, which actually are cattle dung, which are perhaps lit into fire, and burnt ashes of that dung is still available for us in terms of archaeological remains, and such practices are not to be seen elsewhere. Say in North Indian Neolithic or Eastern Indian Neolithic, but Southern Indian Neolithic is typified by ash mound traditions or ash mound sites. So, there is some degree of regionality that you can see from around the beginning of the Neolithic, and in the northwest, where Neolithic has begun centuries before, or in fact millennia before, in Mehergarh, around 2500 BCE or 2600 BCE, we find that the capacity building incrementally has come to a stage where it can sustain a civilizational life. So, a life that is as complex as Harappan civilization. The capacity building for that, in terms of its food basket, in terms of the cattle wealth, in terms of the type of things that they were producing, all those things had formative beginning in the Neolithic period. in the centuries and millennia prior to 2600 BCE in the northwestern part of Indian subcontinent. So that largely is part of the prehistoric subsistence-based economy, where despite all these changes, largely the production is happening for consumption purpose, for immediate consumption, and not for exchange or market or for profit and so forth. And that leads us to the next stage of economic change in early India, that is sought to be studied under the rubric urban experiment 2600 BCE to 1500 BCE. Largely this is what we popularly know as Harappan civilization or Indus Valley civilization. So this is the time when civilizational beginnings are happening, and we also study them as an instance of emergence of Bronze Age civilization. Now, why do we call it Bronze Age civilization? Is all of us know that bronze is an alloy of tin and copper, and we call it Bronze Age civilization not because bronze is central to the Harappan economy, but because bronze is a new metallic entry, which is fairly prevalent. Although if you compare the copper or bronze implements found from Harappa with that of another contemporary Bronze Age civilization, say the Mesopotamia, the Indian assembly of bronze artifacts would be little less as compared to that of Mesopotamia. But bronze is important also from several other technological point of view, and that we will see. So, although it is not as profusely used as in Mesopotamia, yet it does appear that bronze was important, for we have several specimen of cups, bowls, dishes, bronze arrowheads, daggers also. And all of us know that copper is not as ubiquitous as iron as a metal on the planet Earth. It's not very homogeneously found either. So some areas will have copper and a vast stretch will not have copper. It will just not have copper source. So any civilization that becomes a Bronze Age civilization structurally has to depend on trade and commerce and commercial network and trade network to procure copper. If copper is central to their economy or production, so they have to procure it from fixed areas where copper is available, because copper is not ubiquitously present on the planet Earth. Now, copper also is important from the point of view of pyrotechnological stage in which that civilization subsisted. For example, copper melts at 1083 degrees Celsius, and most of the other metals that are used for implements in making bronze as an alloy, tin melts at 232, which is a very low melting point. Bronze with 13% tin melts at 980 degrees Celsius, and that tells you as to why it is a Bronze Age civilization and not copper age civilization as such. Silver melts at 960, gold at 1064 degrees Celsius. So all this tells you that the pyrotechnology of this civilization, Harappan civilization, had developed to the extent where it could attain this degree of temperature. And having attained this degree of temperature also meant that several other possibilities, several other activities could have been a possibility, right? For example, glass making. Now, its melting point, the required melting point, is just above this, whereas iron is also say around 1200 degrees Celsius or little more than that. So they had perhaps not mastered the craft of pyrotechnology to the extent where they could make iron. and therefore there is so much talk of faience, which is a synthetic imitation gem, which was very popular in Central Asia and Mesopotamia. It uses powdered quartz and colorants that is fired at a temperature of 900 to 1100 degrees Celsius. So it comes close to glass, but that is what we get to see in the Harappan civilization in terms of technological, in terms of pyrotechnology. And that has its pertinence to economy of Harappa as well. Possible copper sources, of course, are Rajasthan, Shivalik Hills. Harappans are also known to have trade contacts with say the Mesopotamians, and therefore they could have been procured from as far off as Oman and Baluchistan. So Arabian Sea, at least the coastal area of Arabian Sea, was perhaps being used for overseas trade contacts with the Mesopotamian world by the Harappans. Possible tin sources could be Kokcha River area, which is near Shortugai, which was a trading outpost for the Harappans. It was not a site as such, but it was a trading outpost and close to western Afghanistan. We also get to hear of Badakhshan area, from where lapis lazuli, which was another precious stone that Harappans were using and perhaps procuring it from Badakhshan area, because lapis lazuli is not to be found in the mainstream area over which Harappans existed. Then another important thing, which actually most of the older historians keep talking of, but by now we know that impurities of metal no more are pointers to its source. So earlier, if you read some historians, you will find that okay, this particular bronze material or copper has similar residues or similar impurities as compared to copper found from somewhere else, and then they would say that okay, so if their impurities are similar, that means that they must have been procured from, or their sourcing must be from a particular tin source, where tin also has the same impurities. But this argument no more holds much credence, because in terms of usage, what you get as copper for a particular period actually must have undergone several casting and recasting, and that could have led to impurities getting added at different stages, and they are no good pointer to its original source in terms of mining. However, this insight into copper or usage of copper in Bronze Age civilization also tells us that with bronze tools, several activities like carpentry, seal carving, ivory cutting, bead shaping, drilling, etc. could be done with more precision. So the pointed, the sharpness of the implements, the points in the implements are copper implements are more sharp, and they can chisel the soft stones better, although it has to be harder than the material which is being chiseled. So this accounts for perhaps very intricate ivory works in the Harappan period, and not before it, because in the period before the advent of copper tools, this intricate kind of carving on ivory could not be done, because it must have been done in the pre-copper period by some stone implement or something. The similar thing can be also said with respect to soft steatite, and we have a profusion of such items in the Harappan period. So that again tells us about the criticality of copper tools. Craft specialization is not unique to urban societies. This again is a kind of caveat that we should be using as students of history. Because several hunting and gathering societies, say Chenchus near Hyderabad, are very well known for their superb basket work. Similarly, Bhils are known for brilliant musical instruments, for making brilliant musical instruments. So, artistry and craft activities, they are done by prehistoric people as well, and it is not an exclusive preserve of urban societies, but the artisans in Harappa were producing all this, were making all this for exchange, and this is the difference. They are doing it for exchange and not for aesthetics or not for cultural purposes. But there is fair degree of regularity of turnover in the kinds of production of these items that we see in Harappan period. So, craft specialization is never purely economic phenomenon spurred on by agricultural growth. There invariably are issues of elite fostered demand for this. In fact, craft specialization is never a purely economic phenomenon, and this we get to see from our own history. And there invariably are issues of elite ordering a particular item for its consumption for aesthetic reasons, demand of luxury items. For example, in the Harappan times we speak of procurement of lapis lazuli. Now, those who are, now every person is not using lapis lazuli, only very few people who have enough wealth are using it, and they are using it not they are not procuring it by tradesmen, but they are getting it done on their own account, organizing the procurement of raw material and also perhaps investing in infrastructure to get it safely. And that also goes on to set up a particular kind of taste and aesthetic norms that we tend to understand as not only urban centers but urbanism. So, urbanism comes to connote that aesthetics. So, that is yet another thing that we should be mindful of when we are talking of the economy of the urban phase. Several Harappan sites we get to see as urban centers, but also important are several other sites that serve as the feeders of urban centers, because urban centers are agglomerate of people who are non-agrarian in nature, who are not doing agriculture. So, they have to be supplied with agricultural items for their subsistence, for their consumption, and for that you do require suburbs, agrarian suburbs that feed the urban centers. We don't know much of the social identity of these agricultural communities, because we have not been able to decipher Harappan script. So, we don't know much about the agrarian communities who actually engaged in agricultural works, which served as a feeder to urban centers. Nevertheless, distribution of the Harappan pottery around towns suggests that the agrarian base during the Indus Valley civilization was fairly wide and strong enough to support several towns. So, there are so many towns and they are to be fed, and so that automatically requires a good amount of agricultural production that must be happening in the agrarian hinterland. So, how these agrarian bulk items are transported to urban centers? Maybe by carts, boats, pack animals. They used to transport food grains to towns. We have iconic granaries at important towns in Harappa, Mohenjo-daro and so forth. Rivers probably worked as the arteries of communication between important Harappan settlements, and this also answers another question as to how a vast area under Harappan civilization, Indus Valley civilization, came to have several uniform institutions and practices and cultural traits. Well, these agents of uniformity over this large area could be constant contacts, colonization, that is movement of people from one area to another and coming to pervade that area as in some kind of a dominant relationship in terms of production and control, and also movement of pastoral groups, because this area even today is so rich in pastoral wealth and pastoral communities, and they by nature keep crisscrossing. They don't stay at one place for a longer duration of time, so they keep moving in order to feed their pack of animals, these pastoral groups, these nomadic tribes, and they might also be the carriers, vehicles of cultural uniformity over a large area. Archaeologically, even today, thickly populated and congested nuclei of houses made of fired bricks, clean municipal upkeep of roads and drains, fortified settlements usually divided into citadel and downtown area, they still serve as some kind of an imagery of towns. And where are we getting it from? Obviously, the archaeological remains of Harappan towns. So, that is what is the archaeological imagery of a town or a urban center in Indian history. Agrarian suburbs, we don't know much about the implements of agricultural production, but certainly plough cultivation was happening, particularly in Kalibangan area, which is present day Rajasthan, and that is happening. This evidence comes from pre-Harappan phase. So, there is a long history of plough cultivation, although which material that plough was made of is not sure. Probably it was made of wood, because subsequently Vedic texts do speak of wooden ploughs. And anyway, Indus Plains is annually inundated by floods, but the Kalibangan area, the Rajasthan area, might have had a long history of plough cultivation, because water is hard to come by in this area, and there is general dryness here. So, that could be one possible explanation for this. We have evidence of stone axe in Harappan period. Socketed axe, which is more convenient for clearing forests, come from evidence of socketed axe comes from Cemetery H period, which is little late Harappa or post Harappa, you can say. Historians ascribe it to Ravi people, or some historians can even say that it is the Aryans who are using socketed axe, which is so crucial for clearing dense forests and make it fit for cultivation. Rice evidence, cultivation of rice evidence comes from Kathiawar area. We also have wheat, barley, sesamum, peas grown in greater part of Harappa. Not much is known about the trade in these bulk grains, but during the Harappan period, the urban period, trade in cotton and precious stones like lapis lazuli, amazonite, jade, etc. is quite likely. Sumerian texts, I referred to Mesopotamia, so the southern part of Mesopotamia is Sumeria, and so Sumerian texts do refer to gold, ivory, carnelian, lapis lazuli, peacock, bird figurines, etc., and also timber coming from Meluha, which perhaps is western part of India. That is how Mesopotamians referred to the Harappans. Clay models of sailing boats come from Lothal and Mohenjo-daro. Boats also appear on Harappan seals. There is the stock of a dockyard, identified as dockyard at Lothal. So, these are some of the examples that go on to buttress the argument of intensification of agricultural activities and also craft activities. Also, the technology related to particular metals, particularly copper, tin, alloy, pyrotechnology, and so forth. So, that is what gives depth to the economy of the first civilizational instance in early Indian history that we study as the Harappan period, or that this constitutes the first urban experimentation in early Indian economic history. Thank you.